Participate. All right, enough about you. Let's talk about our next performer, a man who was here a little while ago. He's puts the cowboy and fisher poet, and you're never going to meet another guy like this guy. A great entertainer. That's all I'm going to say. Ron McDaniel, take it away.
Palpation is a subject that's rarely tossed around. It's something we don't speak of as if by an oath we're bound. It started when the doctor said, "Turn your head and cough." I was lined up with the football team like cows along the trough. And since that time so long ago, I get checked once each year. You'd think I'd be used to it by now, but I'm still filled with dread and fear. I feel hopeless and ridiculous as I stand there in the buff. The doctor's technique varies from the gentle to the rough. Some have no sense of foreplay and just start right into groping. Others sort of bob and weave like a boxer rope-a-doping. And now doctors are recommending self-palpation, with women examining their own breast and men are asked to palpate our gonads. That's a medical test? And there's a fine line between self-palpation and fondling that's a little hard to find. I've been told that too much palpation can make a guy go blind. And now as I've gotten older, they've added to my humiliation. My prostate gets a dose of manual stimulation. When I hear that doctor's glove snap, I break into a sweat. The sense of anticipation for what's about to come is as bad as it can get. Though the doctor uses lots of KY, there's nothing about it that's easy. My eyes always fill with tears and my stomach's often queasy. Now, prostate palpation is unavoidable. They're determined to poke that gland. So I've been searching for a doctor who's got a smaller hand. I was complaining to my veterinarian about this annual Randy occasion when a guy like me submits himself to this horrid rectal invasion. "Well, you need to suck it up," he said, "and stop your belly aching now. You should thank your lucky stars that you are not a cow." I'm gonna blame this next poem on our writing workshop, or our presentation workshop attendees. I better not throw that there. It'd kind of creep the next performers out to be what other latex is laced around this stage here. So we had a workshop on presenting or speaking your poetry, and it's over 30 folks attended, and well, thank you, thanks, Dad. That's usually the only one that shouts out as a family member. And so I'm going to do what I suggested you should never do, and that was I changed my set an hour ago. You should never do that. You should just stick to what you've been practicing. But I made a comment, to the class about getting out of your comfort zone. And for me, that comfort zone is humor. The comfort zone is looking at everything, good and bad, through the lens of humor. And so for me, it's been real challenging to write poetry that has a serious theme to it. And the Fisher poets for 12 years now have just nurtured me and encouraged me and taught me to do some things that were outside the circle of things I did. And so I'm going to recite this poem, and some of you have heard it, and so I apologize if you've heard this in the past. But it's a poem for my class. A couple of you have said something, and one of you, Steve, had asked outside, will you do that poem tonight, that serious poem you talked about? Almost a dozen years ago, I lost 4 horses to a lightning strike in a summer storm. And I just kind of bottled that up and tucked it away. My family was fine. There were neighbors that had sure lost more than I had. And in our culture, and I'm sure much like yours, you thank God for the blessings and you don't bellyache about those humps along the way, right? And so I just put that away and then realized maybe a year later, it's okay. It's okay to share a little grief, even if it's for some of the animals, some of the critters. These horses, they help me get my job done, but they also hold a real personal spot to me. So this poem's a tribute to 4 really nice horses God allowed me to have for a little while. How do you grieve for creatures not of the human race? What's the proper feeling or emotion to embrace? Maintain control and be a rock. Don't let your eyes get wet. Still, the memory of these horses I couldn't easily forget. Now, Rocket, he was a 3-year-old. With him I would aspire to train to rope and rodeo. Let my good horse, Tar, retire. And Cody, he was a dead broke horse, a stout, good-looking bay. I'd found him just a few months before to be the mount for my son Che. And Tar, he was the money horse that kept me in the green. He was as solid as they come, a real rodeo horse heading machine. I thought I paid too much for him. That was my early fear. That horse, he won back what it cost me in less than half a year. And the last is not the least. In fact, I miss him most of all. I bought Doc from a cutter who thought he'd grow to be too tall. I put his first ride on him, and there'd be many more to come. In 17 years, that number sure equaled quite a sum. Now, it wasn't always easy. In fact, in times, he was a pain. I was once asked, why you keep that bronc? Well, now I'll try to explain. It's true, he cracked my sternum once, and he dang sure liked to buck. His pitching once cost me a roping title. It was more than just bad luck. But Doc was an honest horse. In all other ways, his manners good. His bucking wasn't meant to hurt me. It was just show me that he could. We both had some things in common, kind of blue-collar workers, you see, nonconformists who want to please, but still kind of long to be free. That horse was as tough as a nickel stake. On him I could always depend to be with me on the roughest jobs until the bitter end. Whether it was roping cattle in the pasture or shipping calves in the fall, that horse never took a lame step. He never failed to answer my call. Now, I don't know if there are horses and cattle roping and riding in heaven, but if good behavior gets you a job on heaven's ranch, well, by the saints, I'll be abiding. And until I get there, St. Peter, you just feel free to ride any of my stock. But if you don't like a horse that'll buck you, you don't put your saddle on, Doc. Thank you. And before I get off this serious note, I'm wearing me a Stop the Pebble Mine button, and thank you. And I'm not really wearing this button to suck up to the fishermen. I'm not. I'm wearing this button for all of us who aren't fishermen, for all of us who aren't from Alaska. See, it's not just their fight. They're leading the fight. They've got the most to lose. But if they have to take on this Pebble Mine outfit by themselves, that's going to be a hard path to travel. So I'm going to be calling my senator in Arkansas, and you probably ought to call yours. because I'm not a really politically active dude. I'm nobody they've ever seen in a protest or marching with a sign. And so it takes a few of us, right, that are just grinding it out every day to say, you need to pay attention to this, because when it bothers a guy like me, it should be bothering a lot of folks. And so you go home and do the same thing. And there you go. That's enough of that. You know, there are stereotypes about cowboys, and I like to kind of break those up when I can. And so one of the most common stereotypes is most people's understanding of our culture came from TV and the movies. And in that situation, the cowboy is always the good guy, and the Indian is always the bad guy. That's Hollywood's stereotype that is untrue. Like any group of people you could single out, there's good ones and there's bad ones. And this poem is a poem that happened in Kansas City several years ago, happened almost exactly like I'm going to tell you. And it's a poem where the stereotypes get broken, and you have to think through this one. And you have to think, who was the good guy? Who was the bad guy? And who was really the Indian? It's called The Taming of Jingle Bob Jim. Downtown Kansas City. We're in town for the rodeo. Jingle Bob Jim, being flush with cash, was buying supper after the show. Indian food, he promised. Well, I've eaten buffalo, or as the natives call it, tatanka. I don't mean American Indian, he said. I'm talking exotic from the land of Sri Lanka. Well, we were out of our place in that Indian restaurant, and folks, it was just like I suspected. Why, the cows that I rope and tie down and one day will eat, in their culture are sacred and protected. Our waiter, though reserved, was a nice enough fella. He said that his name was Haji. He was dressed real cool, kind of an Eastern mystical way. You might say a culinary Maharaji. Well, Jingle Bob was celebrating his bronc riding win with what he called liquid fun. With no idea of what we were doing, we ordered curry with rice and some naan. Oh, I feel that I should warn you, said Haji. That dish you ordered is our most spicy and hot. Oh, before I could thank him, old Jim loudly said, change our order? I most certainly will not. Well, I'm a wild West Texas cowboy, and we wrote the book on hot chow. And I ain't taking no advice about very hot spice from a guy that worships a cow. Well, I apologize for Jim's poor manners. He had no right to be that riled, but Haji said he'd happily serve my friend as he patiently nodded and smiled. As Jim tore into the curry, the bartender yelled, "Gentlemen, last call." That curry was so spicy, old Jim's nose started running like one of the Niagara Falls. He looked hot, flustered, and panicked as he desperately drained those last beers. But they quenched not his thirst. They brought no relief as his eyes quickly filled up with tears. "I can't feel my face," screamed Jingle Bob Jim. "Why, they've seared all the nerves in my head." He was sweating profusely, his nostrils inflamed, his lips were swollen and red. But the external damage was child's play compared to what was occurring inside. That curry was just getting started when Jim realized his colon was fried. Like a witch's cauldron creating a bubbling sulfurous gas, Jim doubled over in pain, hoping beyond hope that farts would be all that he'd pass. He leapt from the table, an odd gait towards the bathroom, stopping every few feet to do squats. Laughter spread across the restaurant as one patron said, "That cowboy's got the Indian trots." What happened next caused a reaction. Must have been the pepper that caused Jingle Bob to sneeze. Like a junior high boy with poor classroom manners, I said, "Jim, did you cut the cheese?" But it was painful to all. The sad reality, this was more than just odoriferous toots. Jim wailed like a baby with no bowel control as that curry began filling his boots. Like volcanic lava with a mind of its own. That crap tide just would not be stopped. We looked on in horror as right there in that restaurant, Jim's britches were suddenly dropped. Like being forced to watch a graphic movie in one of those modern 3D cinemas. We looked on in amazement as Jim self-administered multiple ice cube enemas. Whether it was the shock of the fire contacting the ice or the caustic nature of that very toxic spice, whatever it was caused Jim to pass out on the floor. Any patrons left at this point made a beeline for the door. Yep, the odor and the mess had sure cleared out the place. Should I call the EPA? Is this a hazmat case? And I'm often asked, whatever happened to Haji? Whatever became of him? Well, now he's known and revered among cowboys as the man who tamed Jingle Bob Jim. Good night. Thank you.